The 62-year-old woman stood alone on the train platform, her wedding dress wrinkled and stained with dust. Samuel Tucker turned his back on her, his voice cutting through the afternoon heat like a blade. His words about her age and size carried across the station, drawing stares from every soul within earshot. Ellie Williams clutched her single suitcase tighter. The leather handle had grown slick with sweat. Around her, the good people of Redemption Creek whispered behind gloved hands and hat brims. Their eyes held the particular cruelty reserved for public humiliation. Tucker straightened his vest and addressed the crowd. He spoke of false promises and misrepresentation. He spoke of expectations unmet. He did not speak of the woman who had traveled 3 days by rail to become his wife. The train that brought Ellie began its departure preparations. Steam hissed from the engine like serpents disturbed from sleep. She could board again. Return to Denver, return to her boarding house and the life she had tried to leave behind. But her feet remained planted on the warped wooden platform. A man approached from the edge of the gathering crowd. He wore working clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across weathered features. A small girl walked beside him, her hand tucked into his calloused palm. Arthur Morgan had witnessed enough cruelty in his 45 years to recognize it in all its forms. The scene before him stirred something deep in his chest, something he had thought buried with his outlaw past. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a clean handkerchief. The fabric was worn but laundered with care. His daughter Clementine looked up at him with questioning eyes. The girl's voice carried innocence that cut through the adult world's harsh edges. She asked why the lady was crying. Arthur had no answer that would preserve that innocence. He stepped closer to Ellie, his boots echoing on the platform. The crowd's attention shifted to him now. He could feel their judgment, their curiosity about his interference in another man's business. Ellie lifted her head when the handkerchief appeared in her vision. Her eyes held depths that spoke of trials survived and dignity, maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. Arthur spoke quietly. His words carried regret for the cruelty she had endured. He mentioned the town's nature, its resistance to those who did not fit predetermined molds. The woman's voice, when she found it, held education and refinement. She thanked him for his kindness. Her accent carried traces of the East, of cities and civilized society. Clementine stepped forward, her young face serious with concern. She asked if the lady needed help. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Tucker had moved away, washing his hands of the entire affair. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded. But Deputy Marshal Kane remained, his presence a reminder that some watched everything in this frontier town. Arthur made his decision with the weight of a man who had learned that some choices define everything that followed. He offered Ellie temporary shelter at his ranch. The words came slowly, carefully, as if he understood their significance. Ellie studied his face, searching for mockery or hidden motives. She found neither. In his eyes, she saw something she had not expected. To encounter again, simple human decency. She accepted his offer. The three of them moved through the town's dusty streets. Clementine walked between them, her chatter filling the silence that stretched between the adults. She spoke of her father's ranch, of the horses and the wide sky that went on forever. Arthur's wagon waited outside the general store. He helped Ellie up onto the seat, his hands steady and respectful. Clementine climbed up beside her, already drawn to this stranger who had appeared like a character from one of her storybooks. As they rode toward the ranch, Ellie learned pieces of Arthur's story. He was a widower, struggling to raise his daughter alone. The ranch demanded more than one man could give, but he persevered for Clementine's sake. The child spoke of her mother in the way children do, with acceptance of loss beyond her years. She mentioned feeling poorly lately, how the heat made her tired. Arthur's jaw tightened at these words. The ranch house appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was modest, built for function rather than beauty. But it stood solid against the endless sky, a testament to one man's determination to carve out something lasting from unforgiving land. Ellie saw the work that went into maintaining such a place. She noticed the careful repairs, the garden struggling against drought, the hen house patched with whatever materials could be found. Arthur showed her to the small guest room. The space was clean but sparse. A single window looked out toward mountains that rose like promises against the evening sky. That night, as Clementine slept, Arthur and Ellie sat on the porch. The darkness held sounds of night creatures and wind through dry grass. They spoke little, but the silence between them carried something neither had expected to find again. Stars appeared overhead, bright and numberless. In their light, Ellie began to believe that perhaps her journey to Redemption Creek had not been the mistake she first thought. 3 weeks had passed since the train station. The Morgan Ranch bore signs of Ellie's presence in ways that ran deeper than clean floors and mended curtains. Order had emerged from chaos not through force, but through the quiet persistence of hands that understood work. Arthur found her each morning in the kitchen before dawn, coffee already brewing. The ritual had established itself without discussion. She would pour his cup and hand it to him with the same care she showed everything else. Their fingers would brush momentarily against the warm ceramic. The garden had responded to her attention. Tomatoes climbed stakes she had fashioned from broken fence posts. Beans wound around strings she had strung between poles. The soil, previously stubborn and dry, had begun to yield under her patient cultivation. Clementine followed Ellie everywhere. The child's laughter had returned, bright and frequent. She sat beside Ellie each evening, learning letters by lamplight. Her small finger traced words in the worn primer Ellie had found among her belongings. But the fever returned each afternoon. Arthur watched his daughter's face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Ellie would press a cool cloth to the child's forehead, her expression carefully neutral. The townspeople had taken notice. They passed the ranch in small groups, their voices carrying across the open ground. Their words spoke of impropriety and unwelcome changes. They spoke of the woman who had been rejected but remained. Mayor Micah Bell arrived on horseback one morning. His mount was well fed, unlike the animals of working ranchers. He dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to being watched. Bell's words carried warnings wrapped in courtesy. He spoke of community standards and expectations. He spoke of the difficulties that could arise for those who stood too far outside accepted norms. Arthur's response came from deep in his chest. He spoke of hospitality and Christian duty. He spoke of the woman who had brought order to his household and kindness to his daughter. The mayor's departure left dust hanging in the air. Arthur and Ellie stood watching until the horse disappeared beyond the ridge. Neither spoke of what the visit meant. That afternoon, Arthur returned from checking cattle to find Ellie in the barn. She was forking hay with steady rhythm, her movements efficient despite the heat. Sweat darkened her dress between her shoulder blades. He took the fork from her hands. Their eyes met in the dim light that filtered through gaps in the weathered boards. Something passed between them that had been building for weeks. She had transformed his home. She had brought comfort to his daughter. She had asked for nothing in return except the chance to be useful. Arthur felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced since his wife's death. The feeling frightened him more than any outlaw's gun had ever done. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Ellie spoke of her past. She told him about the boarding house in Denver, about the business she had built from nothing. She spoke of the loneliness that had driven her to answer Tucker's advertisement. Arthur listened to the cadence of her voice, the way she chose her words with care. Education lived in her speech, and something else. Strength earned through trials he could only imagine. The next morning brought visitors. Samuel Tucker rode. Up with two other men, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Tucker's face held the particular smugness of a man who believed he held all the advantages. He spoke to Ellie as if Arthur was not present. He mentioned reconsideration and second chances. He spoke of the wisdom of accepting what life offered, rather than reaching for what was beyond one's station. Ellie's response was quiet but firm. She declined his renewed offer with the same dignity she had shown during his original rejection. Tucker's face darkened with anger and something else. Humiliation. After they left, Arthur found himself watching Ellie more carefully. Her composure never wavered, but he had seen something flicker in her eyes when Tucker spoke of her station. In life, the next day brought another discovery. Arthur was organizing papers in his small desk when wanted posters fell to the floor. His face looked back at him from the yellowed paper, younger and harder than the man he had become. Ellie stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold in her hands. Her eyes moved from the poster to his face and back. Again, Arthur waited for her to speak. He waited for her to gather her belongings and leave. He waited for the judgment that would end the fragile peace they had built. Instead, she sat down across from him. Her voice was steady when she spoke. She told him about surviving slavery, about building a life from nothing in a world that had not wanted her to succeed. She spoke of understanding what it meant to carry a past that others would use against you. She spoke of the courage required to keep moving forward despite the weight of history. Arthur felt something break loose in his chest. The careful walls he had built around his heart began to crumble under the weight of her acceptance. That night, Clementine's fever spiked higher than before. She lay in her small bed, her breathing shallow and quick. The local doctor had been no help, prescribing rest and cool cloths that did nothing to address the underlying cause. Ellie sat beside the child through the night. Arthur found them there at dawn, Ellie's hand resting on Clementine's forehead. The woman's eyes held knowledge she had not yet shared. The morning brought news that would change everything. Deputy Marshal Kane rode up as Arthur was splitting wood. His arrival carried the weight of official business and news from the outside world. Kane's words carried warnings about Arthur's past. He spoke of men who had been asking questions in neighboring towns. He spoke of the danger that came with unfinished business and old grudges. Arthur's hands tightened on the axe handle. The peaceful life he had tried to build felt suddenly fragile, threatened by forces he had hoped to leave behind forever. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Arthur and Ellie stood together on the porch. The wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of change. Neither spoke of what the marshal's visit meant. Neither spoke of the growing danger that surrounded them. But their shoulders touched as they watched the lightning illuminate the distant mountains. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. Clementine woke before dawn, her small body racked with coughing that echoed through the thin walls. Arthur found her sitting up in bed, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. The fever had broken during the night only to return with doubled intensity. Dr. Harrison arrived by mid-morning, his medical bag worn smooth by years of frontier practice. He examined the child with the careful movements of a man who had seen too much suffering. His diagnosis offered no hope, only the familiar prescription of rest and prayer. After the doctor left, Ellie remained beside Clementine's bed. Her fingers traced patterns on the child's forehead while Arthur watched from the doorway. Something in her posture spoke of knowledge held back, of remedies unspoken. Arthur's voice broke the silence. He asked what she was thinking, what she had seen in his daughter's condition that the doctor had missed. Ellie's response came slowly, weighted with the burden of secrets. She spoke of her grandmother, a woman who had healed bodies and souls with plants gathered from fields and forests. She spoke of knowledge passed down through generations of women who had no choice but to be their own physicians. The recognition In Clementine's symptoms was clear to eyes trained in older ways. The persistent fever, the night sweats, the gradual wasting of flesh. The white death that took so many children on the frontier. Arthur's hands clenched into fists. He had lost his wife to childbirth, had watched her fade despite all his prayers and promises. The thought of losing Clementine to something he could not fight filled him with familiar rage. Ellie's voice carried certainty when she spoke of treatment. She knew plants that could ease the fever, methods that could strengthen weakened lungs. But using such knowledge in a town already suspicious of her presence carried risks she could not ignore. The morning brought unwelcome visitors. Mayor Bell arrived with 3 other men, their horses arranged in a deliberate show of authority. They had not come for conversation. Bell's words carried the weight of ultimatum. He spoke of town meetings and community decisions. He spoke of the need for certain elements to be removed before they could cause further disruption. Arthur stepped forward, his body positioned between the men and his home. His voice carried the edge of a man pushed beyond his limits. He spoke of property rights and personal freedom. He spoke of the woman who had brought nothing but kindness to his household. The mayor's response revealed the true nature of the visit. He spoke of ranch contracts and business relationships. He spoke of the consequences that came with defying community standards. After the men left, Arthur found Ellie in the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared herbs she had gathered from the surrounding hills. The plants filled the air with unfamiliar scents, earthy and medicinal. She spoke without looking up from her work. She offered to leave, to remove herself as the source of conflict. She spoke of understanding the price of association with someone the world deemed unacceptable. Arthur's response came from deep in his chest. He spoke of choices and consequences. He spoke of the woman who had become essential to his daughter's survival and his own peace of mind. That afternoon, Samuel Tucker returned with renewed purpose. His offer had changed, sweetened with promises of respectability and security. He spoke of reconsidering their arrangement, of overlooking her advanced years in exchange for her demonstrated domestic skills. Ellie's rejection carried the quiet force of absolute certainty. She spoke of dignity and self-respect. She spoke of the difference between being wanted and being tolerated. Tucker's departure left threats hanging in the air. He spoke of consequences for women who overestimated their worth. He spoke of the danger of reaching beyond one's proper station. That evening, Arthur found Ellie preparing a tea from the herbs she had gathered. The liquid was dark and bitter-smelling, but Clementine drank it without complaint. The child's trust in Ellie was complete and unquestioning. Within hours, the fever began to break. Clementine's breathing eased, her color improved. The change was subtle but unmistakable to eyes that had been watching for signs of hope. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching Ellie tend to his daughter. The woman's hands moved with practiced certainty, adjusting pillows and monitoring the child's response to treatment. In the lamplight, she looked younger than her years, her face softened by purpose. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Deputy Marshal Kane arrived with information about Arthur's past catching up with him. He spoke of men asking questions in neighboring towns, of old enemies with long memories. Kane's words carried warnings about Dutch Van der Linde, Arthur's former gang leader. The man was heading toward Redemption Creek with unclear intentions. The marshal's advice was simple: prepare for trouble or leave town immediately. Arthur's response revealed the depth of his transformation. He spoke of his home and family, of the life he had built from the ashes of his criminal past. He spoke of his refusal to run from trouble that might never come. The marshal's departure left Arthur and Ellie alone with the weight of approaching danger. They stood together on the porch, watching dust settle on the horizon where Kane's horse had disappeared. Ellie's voice carried understanding when she spoke of the past's refusal to remain buried. She spoke of the courage required to face old demons while protecting new loves. Arthur felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of feelings he had tried to keep buried. The woman beside him had become more than a temporary guest or hired help. She had become the foundation upon which his new life was built. That night, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Arthur made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would not run from his past or abandon the woman who had given him hope. He would face whatever came with the quiet determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of change. Lightning illuminated the distant mountains, and in that brief moment of clarity, Arthur understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The storm was coming, and he would meet it head-on. Dutch van der Linde rode into Redemption Creek like a shadow from Arthur's buried past. His black horse cut through the dust with the precision of a blade, drawing stares from townspeople who recognized danger when they saw it. Arthur spotted him from the ranch house window, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips. The man had aged since their last encounter, but his presence still commanded attention. Silver threads ran through his dark hair, and his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had once made desperate men follow him into impossible situations. Arthur set down his cup with deliberate care. His hands remained steady despite the tremor running through his chest. Ellie looked up from her sewing, reading the change in his posture before he spoke. Dutch's arrival meant the careful life Arthur had built was about to crumble. The man had never been one to forgive abandonment, and Arthur's departure from the gang had been both sudden and permanent. That afternoon, Dutch appeared at the ranch house door. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, his spurs chiming against the porch steps. His smile held winter cold, despite the summer heat. Arthur met him outside, keeping the door closed behind him. Whatever Dutch had come to say, it would not be heard by innocent ears. Dutch's words carried the weight of shared history. He spoke of old times in brotherhood, of bonds that supposedly transcended time and circumstance. He spoke of the family Arthur had abandoned in pursuit of respectability. The conversation moved to business with the inevitability of storm clouds gathering. Dutch needed Arthur's skills for one final job, a train robbery that would secure their retirement. His tone suggested the request was not optional. Arthur's refusal came from deep in his chest. He spoke of his daughter and his reformed life, of the man he had become rather than the one he had been. He spoke of choices made and prices paid. Dutch's response revealed the true nature of his visit. He spoke of consequences for those who turned their backs on family. He spoke of the fragility of peaceful lives and how easily they could be shattered. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Dutch had not come alone to Redemption Creek, and his patience had limits that Arthur knew better than to test. After Dutch left, Arthur found Ellie in the kitchen, her hands busy with preparations for the evening meal. She had heard enough to understand the nature of the visit, even if she did not know the details. Her voice carried no judgment when she spoke of the past's refusal to remain buried. She offered to pack her belongings and leave, to remove herself as a complication in his dangerous situation. Arthur's response came without hesitation. He spoke of his refusal to abandon those he loved, regardless of the consequences. He spoke of the woman who had become essential to his vision of the future. That evening brought news from town that deepened the crisis. Samuel Tucker had been spreading rumors about Ellie's herbal treatments, calling them witchcraft and devil worship. The townspeople's fear was transforming into something more dangerous. Dr. Harrison arrived after dark, his face grim with news from his rounds. Children throughout the town were falling ill with the same symptoms that had plagued Clementine. The families were demanding answers, and Ellie's treatments were being blamed for the outbreak. Arthur's jaw tightened as he listened to the doctor's report. The timing was too convenient, the accusations too perfectly aligned with Tucker's renewed interest in driving Ellie away. The next morning brought confirmation of their worst fears. Clementine's fever had returned with renewed intensity, despite the treatments that had previously helped her. The child lay in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Ellie worked over the girl with quiet desperation, preparing stronger remedies from her dwindling supply of herbs. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but worry had carved lines around her eyes. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching the woman he had come to love fight for his daughter's life. The sight filled him with emotions he could not name: gratitude, mixed with something deeper and more frightening. Deputy Marshal Kane arrived as the sun reached its zenith, his horse lathered from hard riding. His news carried the weight of official warning and personal concern. Kane spoke of Dutch's presence in town and the questions his men had been asking. He spoke of the danger that came with unfinished business and old grudges that refused to die. The marshal's advice was practical and urgent. He could offer Arthur protection if he cooperated with the law, but only if Arthur helped bring Dutch to justice. The offer came with conditions that would require betraying men who had once been brothers. Arthur's response revealed the depth of his transformation. He spoke of his desire to live peacefully, but his refusal to buy that peace with betrayal. He spoke of the man he had become and the principles that now guided his actions. Kane's departure left Arthur alone with the weight of impossible choices. He could face Dutch's wrath and risk his family's safety, or he could betray his former associates and live with the consequences of that decision. That afternoon, Tucker returned with a mob of townspeople, their faces hard with fear and anger. They had come to demand Ellie's removal from the community, convinced that her presence was responsible for their children's illness. Arthur met them in the yard, his rifle held casually but ready. His voice carried the authority of a man defending his home and family. He spoke of property rights and American justice, of the presumption of innocence that supposedly governed civilized society. The mob's response revealed the fragility of such principles when fear took hold. They spoke of protecting their children and removing threats to the community's health. They spoke of taking matters into their own hands if official channels failed to act. After they left, Arthur found Ellie standing at Clementine's bedside, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. The child's condition had worsened throughout the day, and the treatments that had once brought relief now seemed powerless against the advancing illness. Dutch's ultimatum arrived with the sunset, delivered by a nervous boy who had been paid to carry the message. The words were simple and direct: join the gang by morning or face the consequences of continued defiance. Arthur crumpled the paper in his fist, the decision already made in his heart. He would not return to his old life, regardless of the price. He would stand with the woman who had given him hope and fight for the future they had begun to build together. The wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying the scent of approaching storm. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and Arthur knew that by morning everything would change. Thunder rolled across the darkening sky as Clementine's breathing grew shallow and labored. The storm had been building all day, matching the tension that pressed against the ranch house walls. Arthur knelt beside his daughter's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. Ellie worked with desperate precision, grinding herbs between her palms and brewing teas that filled the room with sharp medicinal scents. Her movements carried the urgency of someone fighting against time itself. The child's lips had taken on a bluish tint that spoke of lungs struggling to draw breath. Arthur's hands clenched into fists as he watched his daughter slip away despite all of Ellie's knowledge and care. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it the sound of approaching horses. Arthur moved to the window, his rifle already in his hands. Through the storm's fury, he could make out the shapes of mounted men surrounding the house. Dutch had come to collect his answer. Lightning illuminated the yard, revealing 6 riders arranged in a careful semicircle, Their horses stamped and snorted in the driving rain, but the men remained motionless, waiting for Arthur's response to the ultimatum. Behind them, more shapes moved through the darkness. Samuel Tucker's voice carried through the storm, rallying the townspeople who had come to demand Ellie's removal. The mob had chosen their moment, using the chaos of the storm to mask their approach. Arthur found himself trapped between two forces, each demanding something he could not give. Dutch wanted his return to the outlaw life, while Tucker's mob wanted the woman who had become essential to his daughter's survival. Ellie appeared at his shoulder, her face pale but determined. She had heard the voices outside, understood the nature of the trap that had closed around them. Her hand found his arm, offering comfort in the face of impossible odds. Clementine's breathing stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any storm. Arthur dropped his rifle and rushed to his daughter's bedside, his hands hovering over her still form. Ellie pushed past him, her fingers finding the pulse point at the child's throat. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing moved except the shadows cast by the flickering lamp. Then Ellie's hands began to move, pressing against specific points on Clementine's chest and throat. The child's body convulsed once, then again. Air rushed into her lungs with a sound that was part gasp, part cry. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on Ellie's face with the clarity of someone returning from a great distance. Arthur's relief was cut short by the sound of boots on the front porch. Dutch's voice carried through the storm, demanding entry and an answer to his proposal. The man's patience had reached its limit. The front door shuddered under heavy impacts. Arthur grabbed his rifle again, positioning himself between his family and the men who sought to destroy the life he had built. The lamp flame wavered in the wind that leaked through the walls. Ellie gathered Clementine in her arms, wrapping the child in blankets still warm from the stove. Her movements were efficient and protective, a mother's instincts awakened by crisis. The door splintered under repeated blows. Arthur's finger found the trigger of his rifle, prepared to defend his home against all comers. The storm's fury matched the violence building in his chest. Then new voices joined the chaos outside. Deputy Marshal Kane's authority cut through the mob's anger and Dutch's demands. The lawman had arrived with a posse, drawn by reports of trouble at the Morgan Ranch. Arthur heard Kane's voice explaining the situation to Dutch, speaking of warrants and federal jurisdiction. The marshal had been tracking the outlaw leader for months, waiting for the right moment to act. The standoff stretched through the night, punctuated by lightning and the sound of men arguing in the rain. Arthur remained at his post by the window, watching shadows move through the storm while Ellie tended to Clementine. Dawn brought clarity to the chaos. Dutch and his men had vanished during the night, unwilling to face a direct confrontation with federal marshals. The outlaw leader had chosen discretion over revenge, at least for the moment. Tucker's mob had also dispersed, their courage failing when faced with Kane's official authority. The townspeople had retreated to their homes, leaving only muddy footprints as evidence of their presence. Kane stood in the Morgan kitchen, his hat dripping rainwater onto the clean floor. His explanation revealed the trap that had been set for Dutch, with Arthur as unwitting bait. The marshal's plan had succeeded, but at a cost that weighed heavily on his conscience. Arthur's response carried the weariness of a man who had fought too many battles. He spoke of his desire for peace and his refusal to be used as a tool for others' purposes. He spoke of the family he had chosen and his determination to protect them. Kane's departure left the ranch house quiet except for the sound of rain on the roof and Clementine's steady breathing. The child slept peacefully in her bed, her color restored and her fever broken. Ellie sat beside the window, watching the storm clouds break apart to reveal patches of blue sky. Her hands worked steadily at her sewing, but her attention remained focused on the child who had become her own. Arthur found himself studying the woman who had saved his daughter's life. Her face showed the exhaustion of the long night, but also something else. A quiet satisfaction that came from battles won and lives preserved. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright with possibility. Arthur made his decision with the certainty of a man who had finally found his true purpose. He would ask Ellie to marry him, to make permanent the bond that had been forged in crisis and strengthened by shared trials. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer threatening. They had faced the worst that the world could offer and emerged stronger for the struggle. In the distance, the mountains stood clear and sharp against the morning sky, their peaks touched with gold. From the rising sun, the storm had passed and a new day was beginning. The weeks following the storm brought a gradual shift in Redemption Creek's attitude toward the Morgan Ranch. Clementine's miraculous recovery had become common knowledge, and even the most skeptical townspeople could not deny what they had witnessed. Dr. Harrison arrived one morning with a request that surprised everyone. He asked Ellie to assist him with several difficult cases, children whose conditions had baffled his conventional treatments. His pride had given way to pragmatism in the face of suffering he could not alleviate. Ellie's response carried the grace of someone who understood the courage required to admit limitations. She agreed to help, asking only that her methods be judged by their results rather than their origins. The first case brought them to the home of a blacksmith whose daughter had been wasting away for months. The child was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and her skin pale as winter frost. The family watched with desperate hope as Ellie examined the girl. Within days, the child began to improve. Color returned to her cheeks, and her appetite slowly returned. The blacksmith's gratitude was quiet but profound, expressed in the respectful nod he offered Ellie when they passed on the street. Word of these successes spread through the town in the way that good news travels in small communities. Families who had once crossed the street to avoid Ellie now approached her with tentative requests for help. Samuel Tucker's influence began to wane as his motivations became clearer to those who had once supported him. Deputy Marshal Kane's investigation revealed the man's mounting debts and his history of schemes designed to exploit others' vulnerabilities. The revelation of Tucker's true character came during a town meeting, where he attempted to rally support for Ellie's expulsion. Kane stood to address the gathering, his badge catching the lamplight as he spoke of fraud and attempted theft. Tucker's face crumpled as the marshal detailed his plan to marry Ellie solely for access to her savings, then abandon her once again. The man's public humiliation was complete, witnessed by the same people who had heard him reject her at the Pavico train station. Arthur found himself watching Ellie's reaction to Tucker's downfall. Her expression remained neutral, neither triumphant nor bitter. She had moved beyond the need for revenge, finding peace in the life she had built rather than satisfaction in another's suffering. The proposal came on an evening when the sky burned red with sunset. Arthur had been working in the barn when he found Ellie there, feeding the horses with the same gentle attention she showed everything in her care. His words were simple and direct, free from flowery speeches or grand gestures. He spoke of partnership and permanence, of the family they had already become in all but name. He spoke of love that had grown from respect and deepened through shared trials. Ellie's response carried the weight of a woman who had learned to value substance over sentiment. She spoke of the home they had built together and the future they could create. She spoke of the man who had offered her dignity when the world had offered only cruelty. The wedding preparations were modest, fitting for a couple who had learned to find joy in simple things. Clementine threw herself into the planning with the enthusiasm of a child who understood that her family was becoming complete. Dr. Harrison offered to perform the ceremony, his gesture carrying the respect he had developed for both bride and groom. The man who had once dismissed Ellie's methods now spoke of her with the admiration reserved for true healers. Deputy Marshal Kane brought news that Dutch van der Linde had been captured in a neighboring territory, ending the threat that had shadowed Arthur's attempt at redemption. The outlaw leader's arrest removed the last obstacle to Arthur's peaceful future. The ceremony took place in the ranch house parlor, with Clementine as the only witness needed for the promises being exchanged. The vows were spoken quietly, each word carrying the weight of commitment earned through struggle. Outside, the mountains stood clear against the evening sky, their peaks touched with gold from the setting sun. The land that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now appeared full of promise and possibility. The wedding feast was simple but abundant, prepared by hands that had learned to create abundance from humble ingredients. The three of them sat together at the table Arthur had built, sharing food and laughter and the comfortable silence of people who belonged together. That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Ellie spoke of the journey that had brought her to this moment. She spoke of the train station humiliation that had seemed like an ending but had actually been a beginning. Arthur's response came from the deep contentment of a man who had found his true home. He spoke of the woman who had brought order to his chaos and love to his loneliness. He spoke of the future they would build together, one day at a time. Clementine slept peacefully in her bed, her breathing steady and strong. The child who had once been dying now thrived under the care of two people who loved her completely. Her recovery stood as testament to the power of love to heal wounds that medicine could not touch. The months that followed brought steady progress in both the ranch's prosperity and the town's acceptance. Ellie's healing practice grew as word spread of her success with difficult cases. Families traveled from distant settlements seeking her help. Arthur found work with the territorial government, his skills as a tracker and his knowledge of the land making him valuable to legitimate enterprises. The badge he wore carried the authority of law rather than the weight of past crimes. The ranch house expanded to accommodate Ellie's practice, with a room set aside for patients and storage for the herbs she gathered from the surrounding hills. The space filled with the scents of healing plants and the quiet conversations of people seeking comfort. Their love had grown from the seeds of mutual respect into something that encompassed not just themselves but the entire community they served. They had become pillars of the town that had once rejected them, their example inspiring others to look beyond surface appearances. The story of the rejected bride and the reformed outlaw became part of Redemption Creek's history, told and retold as an example of how love could triumph over prejudice and how people could change when given the chance. In the end, they had found what they had been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but home. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. The sun set each evening over land they had claimed through perseverance. And love, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they would face them together as they had learned to face everything that life offered. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.